You're joining us for a special edition here on France 24. Before we go to our panel, Philip Crowther, what's the U.S. president signing right now?
We actually don't know whether this is his announcement that he will be moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, or whether this is just the announcement that he will henceforth, and that the U.S. government will henceforth recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There's also a waiver that the U.S. president has to sign every 6 months. This could be it, a waiver that keeps the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem for now. That is something that is congressionally mandated, and the U.S. president has to sign every 6 months. Once the White House tells us what exactly that document is, we will let you know. From what the U.S. president said there, and contrary to what many Middle East leaders, and in fact many world leaders have said over the last 2 days, he and this administration actually believe that this move to recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital will make the peace process and an eventual peace deal more realistic. That goes, again, that is their point of view, and a very different point of view is held by most experts and leaders in the region. Here's what the president said. This decision is in the best interests of the United States and the pursuit of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. As for the reasons that the president gave for making this decision now, well, there are three here, essentially. First of all, a new policy. This is something that senior administration officials basically said this was not. But U.S. President Donald Trump said this. This is a new approach to conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, a new foreign policy on behalf of the U.S. president. And we all know that this was a campaign promise on behalf of Donald Trump. He said it here relatively clearly, today I am delivering. That is a reference to past presidents who on the campaign trail might have made the same promises but not signed any documents to make this an actual reality. That's a reference from him to his voters. He says that he is keeping his campaign promises. And finally, this is also a U.S. president who says that it's time to change a formula that, according to this administration, simply has not worked. In other words, not recognizing Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. The attitude here basically being, this hasn't worked in the past, let's change this and see if this is better. It's a very optimistic view from the White House that this very, very controversial move that could lead to all sorts of trouble in the Middle East will actually, possibly even in the short run, but certainly in the long term, be good for the Middle East peace process.
Philip Crowther, many thanks for that from Washington. We'll be checking in with you again later on. I want to say hello at this point to Gil Michele, editor-in-chief of Causeur magazine, also columnist for the Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot, also with us from Jerusalem, Palestinian activist Sari Khoury. Welcome. Thank you for being with us here on France 24, and our own Douglas Herbert, who's been watching along with us. Doug, any surprises in what you heard?
Surprising, no. This had been widely flagged in advance. I mean, you could say that perhaps we were waiting to hear what the exact wording would be, but there were no ground earth-shattering.
You said before the show, you said, watch out, let's see what the balance is.
The balance will be. Well, listen, the only real reference that he made to the Palestinians at the end was "God bless the Palestinians" in his final closing remarks. So if you're looking for balance, this was a very. It would be hard to listen to the speech and interpret it as anything but, in a sense, tipping the scales, if you will, towards the Israeli camp, the Israeli side on this issue. That is just a purely factual reading of this speech from what he said. There's an inherent contradiction at the heart of this speech, and it would be hard to listen to it and hear anything else out of it. He says on the one hand that the United States is not taking any position on final status issues. And yet at the very same time, the entire essence of this speech, the entire raison d'etre, if you will, of this speech, is to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So you can argue that for a large audience listening to this speech tonight, presumably a lot of the regional leaders that had warned against the consequences of such a move, especially the Palestinians, probably all of them, if not the vast, vast, vast majority of them, essentially, listening to the speech tonight, will have now had confirmed and validated what they feared this move would mean. And that is essentially that the United States, by reneging on this longstanding policy of leaving Jerusalem, which is the thorniest, most emotionally charged issue in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, by essentially reneging on that policy and declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is essentially abdicating its role as a fair and honest broker in any eventual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Obviously, Donald Trump was clear to say that's not his intent. He was very clear. He spelled it out, saying this is not a departure from our commitment to search for peace. But the fact is, many people listening to this speech tonight, and almost, I would suspect, just about every Palestinian listening to the speech tonight would interpret this and see this as very much a U.S. president taking sides in favor of Israel and basically compromising America's ability to now sit behind that table and basically be able to keep the trust of the Palestinian negotiators at that table.
Gil Michele, you agree?
Yes, I do. I'll use the metaphor of a song. The words are impeccable. He didn't say anything new. From the Israeli point of view, there's a good point and a bad point. He mentioned for the first time the two-state solution, which he abstained from saying from the beginning of his office, and he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But he said, "I don't define what are the boundaries of Jerusalem, so it doesn't exclude the fact that East Jerusalem might be something else." He said that the status quo, the religious status quo, should remain so. Actually, he gave, it's like, the big gifts you put under the Christmas tree in the middle of the city. It's empty, but it's beautiful. And so this is for the word. The words are, you can say, it's a brilliant speech. He nothing to say. The music, however, will be sound, and that's for sure, just like Douglas said. For the Arab street, what you call the Arab street, they will understand the contrary. America is on Israel's side, and they are going to take the holy places out of us. And nothing we will say here or anywhere else will make them change their minds. So this, if you were in a philosophy seminar in an American university, there's nothing to say about it. But we are not. And people all over the world will hear something else.
And with what consequences?
I don't know. I mean, it's obvious that everyone, the worst case scenario is like after the Danish caricatures or the metal scanners this summer, or even worse. We don't know, but anything could happen from Indonesia to Morocco.
Right. But short of that, the chances of some kind of meaningful rekindling of dialogue.
We don't know everything that is going behind when the curtains are closed. Maybe there's something bigger going on, and what Trump just did makes sense to some people. You better move it, because if not, I will move along. But since we don't know, we can only comment, judge what we have.
I'll get the reaction of Sari Khoury, but first we're going to go to Jerusalem. Correspondent Iris Mockler is there. Iris, the U.S. president saying, quote, "Today we finally acknowledge the obvious." What reactions can we expect on the Israeli side?
I've heard one government minister welcoming this announcement, a right-wing government minister, and he was asked. There were two things he might not agree with. One is the two-state solution and the US president's expression of support for that. The first time we've heard him say those words. If the two sides want it, Washington supports it. The Israeli minister was there for that. And he was also asked about the qualification that Donald Trump put in his support for Jerusalem. He didn't set its boundaries. Those were to be set in any final status negotiations. So some wiggle room there, and the Israeli minister even supported that. So I think we're going to see Israelis welcoming this, what many Israelis feel is a long overdue recognition of at least part of this city, if not all of it, as the capital of the Jewish people.
Iris, you were saying to us earlier how the status of Jerusalem, of course, has changed so much in the half century since it was taken over in the 1967 war.
Yes, it is a different city, much bigger. It was a small religious town then, and In some ways, at its heart, it still is, but it's expanded. It's nominally the largest city in Israel, but that includes, of course, the Palestinians who were living in the eastern side, in the Jordanian side of the city, who were annexed by Israel to this greater undivided capital, as Israel's Prime Minister calls this city. It's an interesting city because it's also a very poor city. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish population and the Palestinian population are by and large poorer than other people in this country. So it's poor, it's neglected, and nevertheless, secular Israelis do flee from here, but nevertheless it's a spiritual town, and in its strange way, in this paradoxical way, it is Israel's capital.
Many thanks for that, Iris Makler in Jerusalem. Let's cross over to Sari Khoury, who's there as well. Sari, your thoughts on the future now? You heard Iris describe how the city has changed. After Donald Trump's speech, will Jerusalem be any different?
I'm a little bit lost. I have a loss of words after hearing that rather absurd speech. It starts off by saying there's been no progress in peace, therefore let's recognize Israel's capital. I don't know what's the relation between the two subjects. Then he goes on to say Israel's narrative, he basically adopts Israel's full narrative on the situation. Then he upgrades Israel and says, instead of Israel is always claimed to be the only democracy in the Middle East, now he's saying Israel is one of the best democracies in the world. Then he goes back to absurd Trump embassy as a tribute for peace. And then I guess more absurdity by having probably the largest signature I've ever seen in the world being signed by someone. But Francois, the question that do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Do you hear me? Hello? Okay. But the question that you raise is the question even I ask myself, what is to happen what is the future of the Palestinians in Jerusalem? And what will the PA do? Mahmoud Abbas should have a statement coming up shortly. I would have hoped that he would have sort of said what he had to say before Trump's words to give us some sense of direction. Is this the end of Oslo? And basically, when will the charade end? The Palestinians in Jerusalem are in a bind more than any other, given that, in a sense, on the ground, they fend for themselves. They are treated as second-class citizens by the Israelis, and they have no representation whatsoever anywhere. So the status and the well-being of the people in the city is, for me, the first and foremost question to be addressed, being one of them myself as well.
And on a day-to-day basis, some are saying this Middle East peace, it's never going to come. Some even taking Israeli citizenship, saying, what's the point of waiting?
It's understandable that people need, people need a sense of security, need a sense of, direction or some horizon as to where they might want to go in their lives. Your correspondent colleague from Jerusalem was talking about it's a poor city. But as far as the Palestinian community is concerned in Jerusalem, it's a society that's been impoverished over the years. And yes, people have to fend for themselves. Sometimes if you get an Israeli citizenship, it is not necessarily an allegiance to Israel. It is a way to establish your, as a Palestinian, I am not considered a citizen of anything in Jerusalem. I'm only given resident status. Although I'm born here, my parents have been born here, their parents have been born here. Having a long history here, it is irrelevant. I am here on temporary basis as far as the Israeli government is concerned. Therefore, if I, let's say, travel overseas to study, my status to come back is under threat. Being
Sari Khoury, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're going to cross over to the UN headquarters in New York and the reaction of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Against any unilateral measures that would jeopardize the prospect of peace for Israelis and Palestinians. Jerusalem is a final status issue that must be resolved through direct negotiations between the two parties on the basis of the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, taking into account the legitimate concerns of both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides. I understand the deep attachment that Jerusalem holds in the hearts of so many people. It has been so for centuries. It will always be. In this moment of great anxiety, I want to make it clear there is no alternative to the two-state solution. There is no plan B. It is only by realizing the vision of two states living side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition, with Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and Palestine, and all final status issues resolved permanently through negotiations, that the legitimate aspirations of both peoples will be achieved. For my part, as the United Nations Secretary General, I will do everything in my power to support the Israeli and Palestinian leaders to return to meaningful negotiations and to realize this vision of a lasting peace for both peoples. Thank you very much.
The reaction there of Antonio Guterres, Israel can only be the capital of both Israel and Palestine. He says, your reaction listening to the UN Secretary General clearly siding against what Donald Trump said.
I think it's a very interesting situation and very rare, where I'm not talking about Donald Trump's analysis and the link between what he said and the peace process, but everything he said was true. And this is why probably people are so surprised. And yet, there's something paradoxical about it, because diplomacy's role is to prevent violence. And the main tool of diplomacy is hypocrisy and ambiguity. If you say the truth to everyone, even if now after the show you go home and you say the truth to everyone you encounter, probably you will not get home. Or at least not in one piece. But you can say, I'm just saying the truth, I'm just saying the truth. I mean, running the world is not about saying the truth, it's about avoiding conflict. And this is what we are circling around this evening, because it's very difficult to say, he said the truth, but so what? And this is the problem. What the Secretary General of the United Nations is trying to say is trying to prevent what we are all afraid of, that people will listen to the music and not to the lyrics, and there will be violence. And just one remark about East Jerusalem, and it's not just to make a debate, it's just that 10% of Palestinians chose Israeli citizens, the others rejected it, and
Gil,
they have this choice.
I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're going to hear the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin
So
Netanyahu.
it's rare to be able to speak of new and genuine milestones in the glorious history of this city. Yet today's pronouncement by President Trump is such an occasion. We're profoundly grateful for the President for his courageous and just decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to prepare for the opening of the U.S. Embassy here. This decision reflects the President's commitment to an ancient but enduring truth, to fulfilling his promises, and to advancing peace. The President's decision is an important step towards peace, for there is no peace that doesn't include Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. I call on all countries that seek peace to join the United States in recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and to move their embassies here. I share President Trump's commitment to advancing peace between Israel and all of our neighbors, including the Palestinians. This has been our goal from Israel's first day, and we will continue to work with the President and his team to make that dream of peace come true. I also want to make clear there will be no change whatsoever to the status quo at the holy sites. Israel will always ensure freedom of worship for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. President Trump, thank you for today's historic decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The Jewish people and the Jewish state will be forever grateful.
All right, those are the remarks of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We're told that was a taped statement. Before we return to our panel, let's cross over to Cairo and correspondent Sharif Abdel-Kudus. Sharif, who just a few days ago was reporting for us on the sealing of reconciliation between the rival Palestinian factions. What reactions can we expect beyond the fact that there's been this call for 3 days of rage in the Palestinian territories?
Well, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what the reactions will be on a local level, on a regional level, and a global level, what the consequences will be. We know there have been frantic appeals to Trump by his closest Arab allies, by Sisi, President of Egypt, by King Abdullah of Jordan, by others as well, which indicate that they are genuinely frightened by what the reactions could be. The impact on the so-called peace process, is arguably negligible. I mean, the simple reason being that it has long ceased to exist in any real way. There's been no indications of its revival. There's been settlement building since the beginning of Oslo in 1993, and most Palestinians that we talk to do not believe in the peace process at all. They see it as all process and no peace. And this does come, as you mentioned, during a particularly fragile time, especially during this reconciliation process between Fatah and Hamas, with talks being brokered by Egypt. A very fragile process. But both of those Palestinian factions have come out unequivocally against this move. The Arab League also passed a resolution yesterday warning that recognizing Jerusalem as the Israeli capital would be a blatant assault on Arab nations. There's an emergency meeting called for on Saturday in Cairo following a Palestinian and Jordan request to discuss what the Arab response will be to this move. So we have to wait and see what happens, and we have to remember as well, there's no reference whatsoever to the guarantee of a future capital for a Palestinian state whatsoever, and this really just reinforces what many in the Arab world see as a truth, is that the U.S. is not an honest broker between Israel and Palestine. It has backed Israel with more than $3 billion a year, and backed it militarily, diplomatically, for decades now. And so this seems to reinforce what many see as reality in Jerusalem and across the Arab world.
Sharif Abdel-Kudus, many thanks. You mentioned those reactions from the region, perhaps the strongest from Turkey's president. He spoke earlier, before Donald Trump did, in the company of the King of Jordan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, warning that Trump's move will ignite violence throughout the Middle East. Let's cross now to correspondent Jasper Mortimer, who joins us from Ankara. Jasper, you were telling us earlier that President Erdogan did not reiterate the warning 24 hours ago that he might refreeze relationships with Israel.
No, he did not repeat that threat, but he did say that Trump's move would, quote, dynamite the ground for peace and play into the hands of extremist groups. You notice in President Trump's speech just now that he never once used the term East Jerusalem. He never once referred to the fact that Jerusalem is a divided city under international law. Under international law, East Jerusalem is under military occupation. He did not mention the fact that Jerusalem was physically divided until 1967, the Six-Day War, and that under a two-state solution, which President Trump did mention, the city would be divided in the future, because there is no way that the Palestinians will accept a state that does not include the holy sites of East Jerusalem. Now, when Trump recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, he's recognizing the Israeli definition of Jerusalem, which is that all of the city belongs to Israel.
Jasper Mortimer, many thanks for that. Gil Michele, a quick comment?
I think this is the way it will be understood, but this is not what Trump said. He said that the boundaries are subject to a negotiation. Everyone understands what it means. When he talked about the holy sites and the status quo, everyone, we understand what it means. So I don't think that we can catch him on the lyrics. But again, the music will not sound very good in the Arab states.
Sorry, Corey, let me ask you, President Erdogan of Turkey, by far with the strongest reactions of regional leaders, would you agree that many of the others have been relatively muted over this?
Yes, but I think the line is pretty much the same, especially for regional leaders. What they're saying is, and in Erdogan's words were, recognizing this, this capital is playing into the hands of terrorists. Mahmoud Abbas had a statement that said, this jeopardizes peace, security, and stability. So even for them, the subject of Jerusalem, its Palestinian population, its effect on the actual local Palestinian context is irrelevant. It becomes a bargaining chip to discuss other subjects such as, regional terrorism or extremism.
I was going to ask you, and more, sorry, Corey, when you look at the state of the region right now, do you get the sense that, well, the Arab world, is paying lip service, perhaps, to this, but what they care more about are the divide between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the civil war in Syria, the civil war in Yemen?
Well, as far as the general political scenario in the Arab world, the leaders have been, to put it quite bluntly, disappointments for their people, and people really unable to fulfill their responsibilities and their roles in the region, certainly vis-a-vis the Palestinian cause. And this is not new. This is an old cause. This is an old sort of the same image that keeps getting repeated whenever the occasion, there's a new occasion, but also the international community. So we heard, from the UN now, and they talk about international law, and the UN is an institution to sort of guide or protect what is international law. And when has it ever been applied as far as this conflict is concerned, and certainly towards what is the rights of Palestinians? So we have lip service, from all directions. Theresa May was celebrating Balfour the other day, and today saying no, two-state solution, capital of both people. We get a lot of talk and hardly any support.
Let me turn to Douglas Herbert about this. Doug, the French president, among those who's in the last couple of days have warned Donald Trump not to say what he just said. He's gone ahead and done it. If the U.S. is seen no longer as a neutral arbiter, and certainly isn't by Palestinians after that address, is there someone else who can step in the fold? Antonio Guterres, you heard earlier the French say they have an initiative. Is there somebody else who could rekindle the Middle East peace process?
The Middle East. Listen, this has been, a perennial debate. The fact of the matter is, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, by sort of the geopolitical nature of the beast, if you will, is that the U.S. has always been sort of the paramount influence around that table. And, the Europeans have obviously tried to pull their weight as well, to have a little bit extra clout. You just mentioned Emmanuel Macron. But at the end of the day, it is the U.S., when you think back over the years to past efforts to forge a peace, you'll remember, Clinton on the Rose Garden lawn, obviously, with Yasser Arafat. And it's the U.S. is the paramount player there. I just want to make one other point, though, here. With the context, which is interesting, is we saw Benjamin Netanyahu's reaction, and I think it's easy to forget if you're just walking into this story now, historically speaking, this hard focus on the status of Jerusalem, on this Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, it hasn't always necessarily been as keenly hard-focused as it is now. You have to take the Israeli political landscape into account, and the reality, the factual reality is that it is a real Israeli political landscape which is lurched pretty far to the right. With the rise of much more, the population of Jerusalem over the past years and decades has become both more religious and more diverse. We're a far cry from sort of those old school, the socialists, the Eastern European Jews who came from Russia and Eastern Europe, which weren't as much focused on Jerusalem as the capital. So there's also a reality here reflected in the fact that Israel's own political landscape has gone to the right. Donald Trump is feeding in to that new, further to the right political reality in Israel.
All right, we were talking about the French president earlier. He's spoken. He's on a visit to Algeria.
This is a regrettable decision of which France does not approve and which contravenes international law and the resolutions of the Security Council of the UN.
Gil Michele, your reaction to the words of Emmanuel Macron?
Well, I guess what he says is probably technically true, but this is not the main debate now. Everyone is waiting to see what will happen. Are we before a huge deflagration, riots and violence, or will it pass? We have this Friday to survive, and we'll see what will happen. And
because Fridays are the days when normally there's more protests.
And when you think Israel's main achievement in the last few months or years was the good relations with Arab governments, and the fact that the Palestinian issue became less and less central. And
right now we're seeing a warming of relations with the likes of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
So does that...
The problem is that the good relations between Israel and the Arab governments is what it is. It's not with the Arab people. And the Palestinian issue is the core of the Arab identity, from Morocco through Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and even in the Muslim world. So it'll make Israel's allies like Sisi or like the Saudi court or the Emirates or in Amman, it'll make Israel's allies' lives more difficult tomorrow. They might be obliged to take a few steps back in order to deal with their public opinions. And everyone is talking again about the Palestinian issue. This recognition, does it worth? And I'm not talking about human lives. I'm talking about real strategic achievements of Netanyahu in the last few years. Does it worth to put all this, to risk all this for this declaration? I'm not sure.
All right, the calculus, you're questioning it there, Gil Michele. At the same time, we have this announcement that's made by Donald Trump. It's out there. Douglas was mentioning that if you want to rekindle talks, the U.S. is most of the time the only game in town. Of course, there are precedents where there were other players, Norway, or talks that took place here in Paris, in Madrid, and places like that. Could there be somebody else who steps into the fold at this point?
First of all, you know what's the definition of an honest broker is a broker who thinks like me. The United States is a superpower. It will stay a superpower as long as they are the most important actor. I don't see how you can go around the United States. I don't see how the Russians can replace them. And as for Norway, it was not really a brokerage. It was one of those backtracks that, because of a very specific political context, it could go all the way. And I remind you that the signature of the Oslo Agreement was not in Oslo. So even for the Oslo Tract, it needed to go through the White House in the United States in order to become a reality. So I think everyone will get crazy about it, and we'll see in a few months what's still left to do.
Statement coming out from Hamas, the Palestinian group that controls Gaza, saying that urging Arabs and Muslims to undermine the U.S. in the region. We're coming off those long reconciliation talks to bury the hatchet after an entire decade of a standoff between, on the one hand, Fatah on the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. Sari Khoury, what will Trump's announcement do when it comes to that Palestinian reconciliation?
I don't think it's relevant. I think Oslo was a process that was supposed to deliver results, and every few weeks, few months, there's another nail in that coffin, and no one seems to be announcing it dead. The question is, when will they finally announce it to be dead, so we can move on to other things? I mean, this charade cannot really go on forever. The absurdity is, even a lot of what's being talked about from all parties, but especially, let's say, the Americans and the Israelis, given that they have rather more control over how things progress. It's a war on definitions. Okay, so we define what is peace. We define what is stability. We define what is security vis-a-vis the players, of course, but this war on definitions and this play on words whereby we redefine them as we see fit, given that we have the might to put behind it, has made all these discussions really just futile. Okay, so
but are the words of Donald Trump going to unite even more the Palestinian factions, or you're saying it's not going to have an impact either way on the relationship between Fatah and Hamas?
I think the Palestinian factions, they have their issues between themselves. Obviously, there is rivalry, etc. But there's also the issue that the PA, has been established through the Oslo Accords. And is that process still ongoing or not? I mean, what peace negotiations or process are we still talking about? What is the U.S. still trying to broker, and who is actually still believing that they're trying to broker any type of peace? So what is your role as a Palestinian authority? What are you supposed to do? It's becoming quite vague. We don't know.
Don't know. Let me turn
for the factions between themselves. It's a rivalry. It's a political.
Let me turn now to Cairo and our correspondent there, Sharif Abdelkudus. Your thoughts on that gap that was described between what the leaderships of the various countries are saying and what the citizens of those nations feel?
Well, it's hard to speak en masse how citizens feel, but I think there's a very general knowledge that the U.S. has not been an honest broker in this process, and yet the leaders of these countries, which by and large do not represent their populations, I think are genuinely worried about the reaction on the street to this announcement. You have, if we're talking about Gaza's been under a blockade for 10 years, a blockade that's been enforced by Israel as well as Egypt. Egypt has kept Rafah largely closed. This is a blockade where Israel made calculations of Gaza's daily calorie needs to just keep them right above the point of malnutrition. I mean, this was according to files released by the Defense Ministry of Israel that were released on their court order. And as these negotiations are going way for reconciliation talks that are brokered by Egypt, there's still a lot of sticking points, obviously, between Hamas and Fatah. But the main issue that people in Gaza, when I was just there, is, of course, a lifting of the blockade. This is the main desire of people to go forward. And so, Trump's statement doesn't help in any way.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Sharif Abdelkudus, I want to thank you for joining us from Cairo. I want to thank Sari Khoury for being with us from Jerusalem. Gil Michele, Douglas Herbert, stay with us. Our coverage continues with Laura Cillier right here on France 24.